Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Colton, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, my name is Colton Scrivener. I'm a research scientist at the Recreational Fear Lab at Aarhus University in Denmark and in the Department of Psychology at Arizona State University. And I study the psychology and evolutionary origins of why people are interested in things that are frightening or scary or otherwise threatening, and how they can sometimes derive entertainment value from that and potentially even other kinds of benefits.
Why do we like to be scared?
Well, it depends who you are. The traditional answer to that has been that people like to be scared because they enjoy the adrenaline rush, and that's true. There are some people that for whom that's the reason why they, at least the approximate reason why they enjoy it. But some of my research has found that a lot of people actually enjoy engaging in simulated fear, or for example, like a true crime podcast or a haunted house during Halloween or a scary story. They enjoy that for the potential learning benefits that they get from it, whether that's learning about something that might actually happen or learning something about their own reactions to fear and anxiety.
So is it like a research thing, or is it just like they're never going to be put in one of those scenarios where they're going to be in like a Scooby-Doo type haunted house or anything like that with a killer? Just don't answer the phone or don't leave the house. There's just simple like rules that they learn in their head to follow. And I'm interested in like they're never going to be put in these scenarios. So why are they getting information from it? But they are like dangers, potential dangers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, most likely they're never going to be put in that scenario, but I wouldn't say they'll never be put in it, right? Otherwise, the true crime genre wouldn't exist at all, right? Because
Yeah.
that's about real stories that actually happened. And it's also true that in 2024 in the U.S. and many places in the world now, you're a lot less likely to be a victim of violence than you were even 100 years ago, and certainly 10,000 years ago. And so these motivations to learn about people who are potentially dangerous, who are conspiring against you, who might be out to get you, are very deeply embedded. And if you look across history, a lot of conspiracies did happen and still do happen, right? I mean, famously, like Julius Caesar was conspired against and changed the course of Western history, probably by that, right? So there have been some pretty huge conspiracies that potentially changed the course of not just an individual's life, but many individuals' lives. And so learning about people who are proactively aggressive, who plan their aggression, who plan to attack you, is something that is uniquely problematic for humans, or uniquely a problem for humans, and something that we have tried to solve through being curious about these kinds of things.
Now, do you think it's more about the actual like case? Like if you're looking like a true crime case where it's about solving it and trying to look up the clue. We're all interested in like clue games. That's why there's a whole genre of clue games. But what about when it's the serial killer and people are obsessed with the actual killer themselves? Like getting into the mind, a lot more documentaries have really tried to narrow down what's going on inside a serial killer's head. And I'm like, no offense, I don't really want to enter into that domain.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not for everyone, right? Just like anything is, it's typically not for everyone. But I think the reason that, and true crime gets a lot of flack for this, but a lot of the true crime podcasts and documentaries, they focus a lot on the life and sort of mindset and behaviors of the killer, right? And one of the criticisms of that is that, well, we should be focusing on the victims. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think that, there are two stories to be told there. There's kind of the perspective from the victim side of things and the perspective from the killer side of things. And I don't mean perspective from like uh, from a moral perspective, but from rather um, what they're like and what happened to them, right? For somebody watching a true crime documentary, you kind of already know the victim's perspective because that's the individual that you would be in most cases. In most cases, you would be the victim, not the killer, right? And presumably, if there was a victim, that victim missed some important information from their perspective. They missed some clue, or they missed some sign that this individual was trying to harm them. So instead, what a lot of true crime podcasts and documentaries and stories focused on is the killer's sort of side of things. And again, not their moral side of things, but their uh, like experience side of things and why they did things. And this, I think, gives the audience some insight into, what did the victim miss, or what signs could the victim have seen that they didn't see before? If at the times when it focuses on the victim, often what it's focusing on are victims that got away and how they got away, or victims that didn't get away and what they failed to do to get away, what they could have done to get away. And so it's oftentimes those are sort of teaching moments for what you can do if you're captured and how do you get away, right? You see lots of little short videos online now about if your hands are tied and you're to a pole, like this is what you do to get away. They're very specific
Yeah.
learning moments.
What is the average, I guess, audience base when it comes to true crime? Is it mostly people that are kind of interested in learning more about the victims, or is it mostly the fascination with the actual serial killer? Because, I mean, the psychology, I mean, I like the insanity aspect. I like learning how a person got to a point where they would do something so heinous, because then it helps. I mean, you're not kind of making an excuse for the serial killer, but you're just understanding more about the situation. Like, okay, this isn't just someone who just randomly decided to wake up one day. He just was horribly abused as a kid, and this is what happened.
Right. Yeah, I think, there's some differences depending on who's watching it and why they're watching it, right? I mean, there's a trope that women are more likely to love true crime, right? And it turns out that that seems to be true in every study that I've either conducted or seen, which strangely has not been many. There haven't been that many studies on true crime fans, at least not empirical studies. But the ones that have been done pretty reliably show that women are more interested and more likely to be fans of true crime, whether that's a podcast or documentary or a book. And oftentimes when men watch true crime, they're not always watching it for the same reasons that women are watching it, at least according to a pretty recent study that came out. I think it's still under review at academic journals right now, but it's a preprint available online. And if I remember correctly, women were more likely to watch it for preparedness, for a sense of preparedness, to feel like they, again, can learn something from the situation about how to prepare to either not find themselves in that situation, or if they find themselves in that situation, how to get out of it. And men were more likely to say they were watching it for entertainment value, which is a little vague because, you can be entertained by learning things as well, right? I mean, learning is meant to be fun and engaging, and that's what promotes it, right? Yeah. So there's just not enough research yet on motivations for watching true crime to know for sure, but the research that's out there suggests that many people watch it in order to feel prepared. So whether that's, so I wouldn't say they watch it for the victim or for the killer necessarily. It's just that they are watching it for the situations that arise, right? And they're more likely to already kind of know from a victim's perspective what it looks like. So now they're interested in, okay, what does this look like from the killer's perspective? For the same reasons, many of the same reasons you mentioned, which is that, how did this person come to be this way? Because if you can learn what motivated someone to do something terrible, like, stalk and murder people or become a serial killer, you might be able to identify those people in the real world. You might be able to identify who is more likely to become someone like that, who gives off signs that they might be like that. And so again, you're kind of just getting this behind the curtain look at people who are dangerous or people who might be dangerous.
Now, is there a difference between made up fantasy true crime compared to actual historical documented evidence based? This is something event that actually happened.
Do you mean a difference between a difference in what?
The fandoms, kind of like the people who are more interested in, like, there's a Twilight fantasy you could have if you want and go down that, but then
Right.
there's the
Right.
actual like real Jeffrey Dahmer
Yeah, yeah,
serial
yeah.
killer type psychopath stuff.
There's they're not 100% overlapping, of course, but I actually imagine that they overlap quite a bit. Partly because fictional stories are really good at telling the truth. In fact, they're in some ways better at conveying truth than factual stories, which may seem odd, but with a fictional story, I can take uh, any number of elements of a story and tailor it to fit a new situation, so that I'm sort of um, predicting what a situation might be like, even if I've never experienced it or seen it, right? But I might be taking real events that have happened and constructing based on this. Okay, using what I've seen happen in real true crime, I can construct a pretty good fictional story about what might happen in this situation that just hasn't happened yet, right? Um, and I think that's appealing to many people for the same reasons that real true crime is appealing to people. And so I would imagine there's a lot of overlap in those audiences, but there might be slight differences between people who really strongly prefer true crime versus, say, very intense thriller movie or something about a serial killer.
What about something like an unsolved mystery? The reason I ask this is I've dived into the realm of Natalie Wood's death,
Uh
and
huh.
everyone wants it to be Robert Wagner. Like you can't, like they're screaming it in the comments. Where I'm like, look, I don't have evidence to show that that was this. Like, there's a lot of suspicious stuff, 100%, but everyone's like so quick to jump the gun on it. And it's like, I guess it might be just this fascination with we don't really have an answer. I mean, they changed her autopsy and everything from accidental drowning to just mysterious circumstances in like 2014. So like that opened up the door for all these people to just start trying to fill in the gap. And I'm like, hang on, we have no evidence for half of these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a couple of things there. I think that, an unsolved mystery does a few things, right? One is, especially when it's been changed from something somewhat certain to something more obscure, like, mysterious circumstances for the death. One is that it means that if somebody did kill this person, they did it pretty well, in the sense that they covered up their tracks pretty well, which means they're a pretty capable, dangerous individual. So I would want to learn even more about them, right? I would be even more interested in learning about this person and how they did what they did and how did they get away with it. The second thing that it does is that it allows people to kind of have their own pet theories and run with those, because there's not clear evidence, right? Your mind is often trying to resolve uncertainty around your environment, especially when it comes to threats. And for, most of human history, we didn't have a legal basis. And even in many parts of the world today, you don't have a legal basis where it's like, innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, or beyond a shred of doubt, or there was no, each culture may have had their own way of dealing with that, but it often wasn't the case that you were presented with material evidence, certainly not photographs and video evidence and things like that would just prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that someone did something, or DNA evidence, right? And so, our minds are not built to deal with evidence like that when it comes to something that's happened in the past. We deal with, the information that we have at hand and what looks suspicious and what signs we can see. And I think that's why you often see people in the comments, explaining why they think somebody did something, even if they don't have evidence, hard evidence for it, right?
Is there certain personality types, like when it comes to people that are more attracted to, I'm not gonna say just true crime, but just fascinated with the horror factors? Like, is there like a propensity? I know you mentioned a gender factor, which is with women, but is there like certain things, like if someone experienced trauma in their past, that they be more likely to look into this stuff or less likely to look into this stuff?
Yeah, there's not a lot of evidence for that, but there is a little bit of I would say like circumstantial evidence for that. That people who have experienced trauma in the past are actually more likely to seek out information about potential threats around them, right? Or potential threats in their environment. It's, if I say threats around them, that it would include things they see on TV, right? Even though that particular instance may have happened 5,000 miles away 30 years ago, right? But it's information that's around them. And it kind of makes sense, right? Those people are more likely probably to be a little bit anxious. And when you're a little bit anxious, you're more likely to be vigilant towards threats. Vigilance towards threats means learning about threats. And so when you're presented with threatening information, like a true crime podcast or a true crime documentary, even a horror movie to some extent, you're going to be attracted to it, and you're going to be, more immersed in it and more interested in it in many ways. And again, because, learning involves feeling entertained, feeling you're enjoying something, because that motivates you to go back and do more of it. You might even find it entertaining, find it, almost like not quite a leisure experience, but in some ways, kind of a leisure experience to consume these things.
Now, is this relatively new just because the advent of like podcasts, like true crime and stuff like that? Because we've always had a horror culture. There's always been an interest in going to like horror movies, but it seems to have, I wouldn't say evolved, but it expanded out to where now a lot more people seem to be interested. Either that or my algorithm is just showing me more horror hashtags than usual.
Maybe a little of both. Yeah. True crime is just one medium through which you can learn about dangerous people. Right. For most of human history, we've just been telling stories, right? You hear it in gossip from your neighbors or your friends or your family, right? And it was much more localized, which meant there were fewer instances of it. If I live in a small group of 300 people, I'm going to hear about every true crime-like incident that happens, but they're not going to happen that often because there's only 300 people, right? So that kind of deters people from doing things like that, but it also just reduces the statistical likelihood of that happening. Now we live in a world with what, 7.5, 8 billion people, and we can get information from across history because people are putting together audiovisual stories about it in really compelling ways. And so we have sort of an unlimited supply of true crime stories now, I think is the difference. It's not that we're more interested in it. It's just that we have more access to more stories in more detail than we've ever had before. But if you look back at like even the origins of, the true crime genre, I don't know how long it's been around, but let's say, 2 decades as a real genre, right? At least with the advent of podcasts, that kind of took off. Of course, there were older true crime stories that were around, but I think it really took off with podcasts. And then the horror genre, you could say, has been around as a proper genre, maybe, 150 years. But again, scary stories have been around probably since we've language. But if you go even further back to the printing press, and when people first started consuming stories in a way that weren't oral stories, some of the first things that were printed on the printing press were true crime stories. They were stories of murders, of deaths, of people killing other people. There was one, I can't recall the name of it. It was a very long and descriptive name, and I have a book coming out next year, and I read about it in the book because I found it really fascinating that like one of the very first things we printed in the printing press was the story about a woman who murdered her 4 children and then killed herself. And it was, just in excruciating detail what she did, how the kids failed to get away, and then how she got away, how she did it, right? And it really followed kind of the same formula that modern true crime follows. And there's no doubt that, that wasn't the first story about someone murdering someone and getting away with it, right? We've been telling those stories, again, probably forever. It's just that when we have a new medium or a new way to tell it, or we can revive old stories in interesting ways, we do that. And now we have the ability to, again, search, historical documents, create compelling visual reenactments. We have almost an unlimited supply of stories and an ability to retell those stories. And so there's just tapping into something, when somebody creates something like that, it's tapping into something very evolutionarily old in everyone's mind that causes them to be interested in that, even if they've heard the story before. Like when the Dahmer series came out, it was not a new story. Most people knew about Dahmer. Maybe they didn't know the whole story. Maybe they didn't know, they hadn't sat down and read about it from front to end or watched another documentary on it. But there had been other documentaries about Dahmer. Certainly there had been other dramatizations of Dahmer. But this one was more visually compelling. It had a fairly famous actor in it. And it told the story, pieces of the story in ways that probably hadn't been told before. And it was shot in a very compelling way, right? It was the cinematography and the storytelling were very good. It was also like a very well done miniseries. So all those things together, make it, even though it's a story many of us have heard before, make it a really attractive thing for us to consume, right? Of course, humans love retelling stories. Most people never watch a movie one time and then never watch it again. Many people rewatch movies or rewatch series, just like we rewatch or re-listen to stories of serial killers.
Have you ever thought about it in the term of like myth making when it comes to some of these serial killers and kind of names that seem to cross borders even into things that people aren't interested in? Like we mentioned the awareness of danger when watching this, kind of being prepared, but also there's like names that have crossed over into groups that I know don't watch true crime and shouldn't know what that name is. Charles Manson being an example. He's historically significant for the factor that you can show a picture of him and his name, everyone knows it. But there's very few people like that. And I would blame media for that, just like with the Zodiac killer. Like if they didn't popularize it so much in the newspapers and it turned into this whole forum and this story kind of just grew and grew and grew, and everyone now knows the Zodiac killer. They don't know who exactly, but they know the name Zodiac killer.
Yeah, I mean, I think, is the media to blame? Partly, yes. But at least when it comes to entertainment, I mean, the media doesn't have an agenda aside from selling clicks and then selling viewing time on TV, right? And what sells that is what people are interested in. And what people are interested in is hearing unsolved mysteries, right?
Yeah.
Or mysteries about these mythical individuals or semi-mythical individuals who can commit a crime and get away with it and never be caught, because that's really frightening to live in a society where people can do things like that and never get caught, right? So yeah, is the media propagating it? Yes, but they're propagating something just based on what sells, right? So yeah, partly to blame maybe, but also just human psychology is partly to blame.
What about the myth making aspect?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I'm not an expert on myth, but I know from what I understand about it, I would say that myth making is actually an outcome of the way we deal with human individuals, right? If you look at, I think the Greek gods are a great example of this. You have this whole pantheon of gods or deities, and they behave in ways that humans behave. They get angry, they get jealous, they get happy, they get sad, they feel all the human emotions. They act in human ways. The stories you tell about the Greek gods are them basically being a bunch of humans that live on a different plane, right? So when we make myths, we're making myths based on human psychology about other humans, right? So when we make a myth about a serial killer, yeah, I think we're myth making a little bit when it comes to things like the Zodiac or Jack the Ripper or people like that, right? But really, that's what that psychology evolved to do, right? It was then co-opted later for myth making, but that was actually probably the original purpose, was telling stories about other humans and sort of making them up into something frightening or something scary. Like if you imagine, say, 50,000 years ago, or even less, say 10,000 years ago, you have stories of maybe a terrible beast in the forest that will hunt you and kill you if you go out into the forest at night. Now, there's a couple of reasons that story might have been created, right? One reason might be that there are predators out there, bears, wolves, whatever. 10,000 years ago, it could have been dire wolves or cave bears or some other terrible ice age megafauna that would have killed you. But another reason that you tell stories like that is because there are other kinds of dangers out there. It could be other hostile groups of humans, right, that are doing these kinds of things. And you create something that attracts attention, and predators attract our attention for a number of reasons, and you give them features that are exaggerated: huge teeth, huge claws, massive size, right, lightning speed. You give them features that make them seem larger than Earth, that almost mythologize them in some ways, and that makes it a really easy story to remember and to retell. And so the point is to keep you away from this certain area, to keep you from doing a certain thing, right? And it almost doesn't matter what the perpetrator is or what the threat is. It's more important in those cases that you just don't do some kind of thing, right? And so you can create a horrible story about a monster to make it easy to retell and memorable and interesting. But really, the monster might be another group of individuals, or a person even, that's really terrible, that lives in that area, right? So yeah, we mythologize things all the time, but I think that psychology originally evolved really to deal with people, right? To deal with exactly what it's doing with true crime.
Now, when it comes to it being healthy to look into this type of stuff, and I mean, fine line, it's kind of like a two-part question, but when the word obsession starts to be brought in to where people are like, I get it if you like true crime and you have a favorite true crime podcast, but if your whole house is decorated with giant butcher's knives with blood's dripping off of it, I don't necessarily want to be your friend.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anything that you are obsessed with, that to the extent that it interferes with your ability to live a normal life otherwise, is bad, right? It doesn't matter what it is. You could be obsessed with vegetables to the point that it's bad for you, right? Like, there's nothing in excess is good. And that's true for true crime as much as it is for vegetables. I don't think it really indicates much more than that, other than, an obsession is an obsession, and that's usually not a good thing. There are probably rare instances where it's something different, but I would say in almost every case, an obsession is an obsession. And it's easy to become obsessed with something like true crime or horror because, again, the average person has, built within them a pretty strong threat detection, threat monitoring system in their minds. And there's variation around that, just like there's variation around personality traits like extroversion. Some people are more extroverted, some people are less extroverted. Some people are extroverted to the extent that it's almost harmful to them, right? Or some people are introverted to the extent that it's almost harmful to them and they're flourishing. The same is true of how interested we are in threats and learning about threats. And you can be on one extreme of that to where you do have your house decorated with you know, serial killer paraphernalia. That doesn't necessarily mean anything's wrong if it's not interfering with your life otherwise, right? If it's not, and it doesn't necessarily indicate any kind of psychopathology. Probably means you're a bit. If I were to, just take a guess, I would wager that individual has a bit higher than average anxiety, probably female, probably a bit of a risk taker, a bit of a like rebellious attitude. But other than that, it doesn't necessarily mean that anything is criminal about them, or again, psychopathology is aside from maybe elevated anxiety.
Is there anything about the true crime kind of focus or just genre in general that would be able to alert somebody if someone had criminal tendencies? Like if you were going to think about in the future, like a Tom Cruise movie, but like something where you're able to like give somebody a little test and they're very obsessed with how the crime was performed and how this person got away with it. You'd be like, okay, you're very obsessed with the whole factors we really didn't want people focusing on. Like we rather care about the victim or look into more the psychology of the serial killer, but you're interested in how he was able to do something like OJ. I don't know. Like I'm interested in the Naked Gun movies. People don't understand that, but it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, that's an experiment I would love to run, right? Is do true crime are true crime fans actually better at solving true crime? Are they better at getting away or at seeing a sign earlier? That would be a great test of that hypothesis that it's really about, to some extent, learning or preparedness. I mean, the most I can say is that in the studies that I've done and the studies that I've seen that I wasn't involved in, a lot of people's explicit motivations, especially women, for watching true crime or listening to true crime is to learn small things, like just little techniques, little signs, little things from the story. There was a study conducted probably a decade ago. It was one of the first, maybe the first empirical study on motivations for watching true crime and sort of interest in true crime, and showed that women were really interested in parts of true crime where showed how the victim got away, like what they did to get away, right? If they were already captured, what little tricks or techniques did they use to escape? Which again suggests that at least some portion of the motivation for watching that is learning these little techniques, right? That's like the part that really draws you in and keeps you interested. Does it really work? Again, hard to say. I can only think of one study. It wasn't an academic study. It was like a national survey. I mean, it was conducted in a manner that was consistent with that, but it was more of an industry survey, I think. And people said there was some portion of people who watched true crime who said that it had helped them not become a victim in at least one case, that they thought they were going to become a victim. Now, how would they know that they were going to become a victim? Maybe they were overreacting, right? Like if you're walking down an alley and someone's following you and they learned, like, don't do this because you're more likely to find yourself in trouble if you do this, So it's hard to say if anything they've gleaned from true crime has actually helped them in the real world, or if it would help them. But that seems to be the motivation and interest for a lot of people, is that.
Can I ask if it would expose people to violence, that it would cause violence? Like, yeah, I heard playing video games can do that. I mean, I'm sure it's probably not true at all, but I just didn't know if there was any evidence or any studies that really examined that.
Yeah, so there were, millions of dollars spent in between the 90s and early 2000s on video game violence. Which if anything would be, if there's going to be an effect, you would see it in video games because you're physically, moving, you're doing things that cause the simulated violence, right? You're moving joysticks or you're moving whatever to make the simulated violence happen. And the end result of all that research and 2 decades of people's entire careers were spent on this, is that there's really no evidence that violent video games cause any kind of violent tendencies or aggression beyond what was already there, right? So would a person who's already really violent also enjoy violent video games? Yeah, maybe, right? Is it going to make them act out their tendencies when they wouldn't have otherwise? No, there's no evidence for that. And there's no evidence that people who are not violent suddenly become violent if they play a lot of Grand Theft Auto or something. I think the same thing is going to be true for true crime. I don't know of any studies that have explicitly looked at true crime consumption and tendency for violence, but given that a large majority of true crime audience, a large majority of the true crime audience are female, and that males commit most of violent crimes, that seems surprising to me as well, right?
Wait, what about serial killers though? Isn't that mostly females?
You mean perpetrators like serial killer?
Like women that are serial killers.
No, most.
I thought that was a larger statistic than it was with males. Because if you look at like the 1970s and 1980s, it seems like there was a whole trope about not letting your kid be in the doctor's office by itself because there's all those, what is it, the Lady in Death? Lady of Death. Remember her? It's oh
Uh,
God, I had the journalist on my show who
are you talking about the
interviewed her.
nurse
Killed like
who?
60 something babies, speculated. Yeah.
No, it's much more likely to be males. So it's any kind of. I think the last statistic I saw, and this was not specific to serial killers, but men commit something like 90% of violent crimes or 85% of violent crimes. If you, I don't have the statistic on hand, but we could look it up. But
I believe you.
I would imagine that serial killers probably like 95% of them are male.
I thought it was like the most violent action was done by men, and then like the women did it like in a slow way. Like
In a
because you
slow,
always
so
hear about the
there probably
poison.
is there probably is a sex difference there, right? Like if you're a serial killer, uh, and you're a man, you're probably more likely to be a violent serial killer, like a violent, sort of up close and personal.
Give him a nickname, call him the butcher.
Yeah, exactly. His myth would be the Butcher Man, right? If you're a female and you're a serial killer, that would be much less likely. But if you were, it's going to more likely be something indirect, right? Like poisoning you or something like that. And what's interesting is that actually tracks with the way that men and women commit aggression in general, like non-homicidal aggression in general. Women are much more indirect in their aggression. Men are much more direct in their aggression. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of which is just average size and strength differences, right? But yeah, I would be shocked if more than 10% of serial killers were female.
Now, has there been more of a focus in studies done since a lot of the stuff's become more trendy? And also, why is there a little bit of a lack of study in certain areas?
Well, to answer your second question, I have no idea why. It surprised me too because it's something that is one of the most popular genres, and we don't know hardly anything about the people who watch it, right? Um, or at least the people who are huge fans of it. Uh, as to your first question, has the research become more popular or more common? Yes. I don't know if it's because true crime has kind of taken off more in the last 5 years or so, or I don't know why. I mean, one reason why could be that. So, like when I first started looking into this stuff, and this would have been around 2019, 2020, probably. Um, I did a lot of foundational work on this idea of morbid curiosity and that people seek out information about threats, and they often do this in ways that involve entertainment. And I created a scale that you can use to measure that. And one of the subscales of that was the Minds of Dangerous People, which tracks pretty closely with interest in true crime. And there's been at least one study that used that scale to measure true crime or dangerous people interest, maybe two actually with this recent one. So I think there are ways to look into it, right? There are psychological instruments you can use to measure that. There's some some theory building that's happened in the last couple of years about why people are interested in true crime, and that's helped other people become interested in studying it. And probably because it's becoming more popular, and people are still asking this question of, well, why are we so interested in seeing this? And that's probably prompting some people to look into it.
What about when I saw you wrote this on your Substack, but when people dream about certain actions like true crime?
I mean, dreaming is kind of the last frontier for human psychology, right? We don't really know a lot about dreaming. Um,
They say it reflects like some type of inner meaning, so that's scary if you're dreaming up horror stuff.
yeah, I mean, it's so hard to study it's so hard to study dreaming that it's difficult to come to any exact conclusion about what it's for or why it happens or why you dream about specific things. There's a really interesting theory that was put forth, I think in like 2000 maybe, called the threat simulation theory of dreaming, and I think that's what that post was about, was this idea that your dreams are not random neuronal firings, right? They're very they're often strange, and but they're still coherent audio visual simulations, right? And that takes a bit of coordination to actually simulate audio visually something semi-realistic, to stimulate your the rest of your body in the way that your body is paralyzed during sleep most of the time, at least during REM sleep, and so you can't move, but a lot of those electrical signals are still going to your muscles as if they were going to move. So you're basically doing a full body simulation of something, right? That's why if that paralysis fails, you wake up and you flail or you kick or you sleepwalk or do a number of other things. So the question then is, that takes quite a bit of coordination for something like that to happen. So how does something like that evolve? Like how do you evolve a full body simulation in the middle of your sleep for a very specific part of your sleep? And what this guy put forward was that his last name was Ravonswo. I think Anton Ravonswo, Anton, can't remember. Ravonswo was his last name. Put forward was that, well, like many things, threats are very strong selection pressure in human psychology, and maybe it was simulating threats that originally kind of evolved the machinery for that, right? That produced the selection pressure for that. And then once the machinery was there, dreams could become anything, right? They could be about whatever. But there do seem to be our dreams do seem to be somewhat sensitive to threats that happen in the environment. So if you go through something traumatic, you're more likely to have nightmares, right? If you watch a scary movie, one of the biggest fears people have is that they'll have nightmares about it, right? So they do seem to, at least when it comes to threats, they do seem to be sensitive to threats that happen in the real world. Now, it's not clear why or what that would do. I mean, one possibility is that if it is a full body simulation, it's just a way to prepare for threats, even physiologically, even if it's not consciously, physiologically prepare for them, keep those connections tight while you're offline, while you're sleeping, right? It could be a way for you to remind yourself when you wake up and you have a nightmare. You often remember it, and you might tell someone, especially when we were lived in smaller, more connected groups. You would wake up and tell someone about this, and when we didn't know what dreams were 10,000 years ago, let's say, that would have been a really frightening experience, right? Like to have this stimulation, and you don't have maybe a concept of what a dream is, or that dreams were probably seen very differently 10,000 years ago than they are today. And it might have been, there are many cultures around the world that believe that you do go to a different place when you dream, and it's a real place, and you experience these things. And so those are sources of truth in many ways. And so you wake up and you tell these stories, and it could kind of keep you alert to potential dangers that are around, or just alert in general, vigilant in general. So if you're anxious about some threat, and then you go to bed, you have a nightmare that's maybe unrelated to the thing you're anxious about, but you do have a nightmare about something terrible. You wake up and you tell people about it. Now you're very vigilant about something. Being vigilant about something helps you catch other threats that you might not have seen otherwise, like that are totally different than what you were anxious about in the first place.
With the new studies that are coming out, are you guys focusing on a lot of true crime podcasters and kind of like their opinions and takes? From my friends who are true crime podcasters, they've talked about how they get a lot of crap for not being historically accurate if it is based on a real event. Certain details will be corrected or certain things will be corrected. So eventually these guys turn into investigators. And when I mean that seriously. It's like they're digging through old newspapers, depending. Like I have a buddy who focuses on more older British crimes. So he's focusing specific in a niche, but he has to go through old documents, archives. He actually has to go to places and try and find newspaper printings and clippings you can't just find on the internet. So to me, when I hear him explain this, he's very like, this is 100% what I could find. And it's because I don't want to get crap for saying something about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know of any studies about people who tell the stories, really, right? People who are just uncovering the stories and telling them. There is evidence that spreading threatening or telling threatening stories, spreading threatening information tends to be viewed as a valuable source. If you do that, whether it's true or not, you tend to be viewed as a valuable source, as a trustworthy source, as an important source of information. And so I'm sure that's some of the unconscious motivation for that as well. But yeah, there's not really any studies, and I certainly don't have any, at least planned right now, about studying, let's say, like true crime podcasters. But I mean, I think it's a really an area that's ripe for study, right? And not just true crime podcasters, but people who tell scary stories in general, right? Like, what is the psychology behind telling scary stories? For a long time, we had no research on people who consume scary stories. Now we have a little bit, but we still have pretty much nothing, to my knowledge, about about people who tell scary stories, who tell true crime, who conjure up horror movie scripts, who write true crime novels or horror novels. We don't know a lot about that. Certainly not about their psychology, and so that would be an area that, yeah, would be really ripe for study.
This is another one that I just want your opinion on because I don't think there's probably a study for it. But is there a certain look at of when it comes to when people view certain true crime stuff? Mostly everyone thinks night, but I know a couple people that watch it like when they wake up. It's like, I mean, that's part of the obsession factor, but I'm like, that's a really crappy way to start your day.
Yeah. The people who watch it in the morning, are they people who watch it often?
Not that often, just in the mornings. Like it's like like how people have their daily affirmations. Their thing is just like turning on like a Dahmer episode or watching some type of documentary that's like pretty brutal.
I guess is that much different than watching the morning news and hearing about all the terrible things that happened
That's a good
the
point,
night
but
or day before?
still.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's more explicit, right? Like I'm turning on Dahmer to because I know that I will be watching, this story about a horrible person. But when you turn on the news, you kind of know that too.
Yeah.
You might also be watching for the weather, but you're still paying. If you're in the kitchen cooking, you're still like peeking over, paying attention when there's a story about a horrible murder that happened.
Yeah, but if you're working retail and you're turning on the Ted Bundy tapes before that, I'm a little bit nervous.
Yeah, yeah. Again, if it's something that interferes with your daily life or is interfering with your daily life, it's not healthy, right? I mean, it's just not. And again, that doesn't matter if it's true crime or something else. I think it scares us more when someone is obsessed with something like true crime because it seems like something should be wrong with them. It seems like something, there's something wrong with someone who could watch true crime at 8 in the morning while they're having their coffee. I think the truth is, I think the truth. So most people who watch true crime, listen to true crime, or watch horror movies, or read scary books, they're not watching it to, enjoy the suffering of the victim. That's the thing we're concerned about, right? Is that people are watching this and they're enjoying it because they're watching someone be murdered and they like watching people be hurt. There doesn't seem to be any evidence for that, at least from, are there some psychopaths out there who are doing that? Sure, probably, yes. But the average person, the average horror fan, the average true crime fan isn't watching it because they enjoy watching people suffer or people be injured or harmed or whatever. And so I think that it's concerning because we think that that's why people are watching it, but that's really not why. It doesn't seem to be why people are watching. The average person is watching it. So I think it just looks more concerning than it is probably when it comes to true crime or horror or any other sort of scary story.
What has been most revealing to you through your research when it comes to just the whole true crime genre?
Um, I think just how old that motivation is, right? I think it's easy to imagine that this is just a phase, right, that we're going through because podcasts are popular and because miniseries are not, for whatever reason, like this is the true crime era and it feels like the true crime era and it's just something that's happening now and won't happen in the future, didn't happen in the past. But again, like I said, the oldest written stories we have are true crime. I mean, the oldest problems humans have faced are those that are related to true crime that have to do with someone conspiring against another person to harm them. I mean, that's like the oldest human story. And so I think, yeah, just how old these motivations are and the tropes are even. There's something that's very deeply embedded in human nature and human culture, and it's not something that just popped up in the last 15 years and is having some kind of brief blip in human history.
I'm forgetting the title of this movie, but it was like a Black Balloon or Black Phone. That's what
Black
it was.
Phone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you find that interesting that that was such a movie to come out? I mean, years later, but that was a really big issue with kids being abducted in that time period. And it was very real
Well,
for a lot of people. So when that movie
yeah.
came out, I was like, are we ready for that? Because like a
Yeah, I
lot of
mean, I
people
think
still scarred.
that's one reason it was such a hit, right? Is that because it tapped into something that really happened and you know because of the way kids play today, probably won't happen again, but is within the realm of possibilities of happening again. Now, despite the sort of supernatural elements, setting those aside, like the baseline story about someone driving around in a was it a black van, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Is it like a van? And abducting kids when they're out playing. I mean, that's something that really happened in the 80s, something that, most people now in their 50s, probably 40s, maybe 40s remember. And so it's going to ring very true for them, even though, again, a great example of fiction telling something pretty factual, right? Like using fiction to tell a news story that is plausible and can, in some ways, could happen or did happen. So I think that's why it rang true for so many people, is that it was something that, it was representing something that did happen when they were kids, right?
What about that's I don't know. Sorry, that's the kidnapping kids thing always got me a little bit. When that movie came out, I was like, I'm not watching that. I have little nephews, so it's kind of a sensitive subject. And I was a little kid. Like, I mean, do you think it's prosperity that has caused us to have this obsession with such horror genres and why it's become such a big part of everything now? We've always had the obsession, but never to this extent. And I think it's because we don't really, the kids aren't getting kidnapped left and right. I mean, it still happens, but it's not as bad or as pushed out there in the media as it was before.
Yeah, I mean, scary stories are partly aversive, right? So you have to offset that aversion, right? If I tell a story about a kidnapping or a brutal murder or something, many aspects of that make me not want to see it or hear it, right? So the thing that kind of offsets that is relative safety. So if I'm much more likely to watch a TV show about a murder than to want to go out into the streets and watch a murder happen, right? For a number of reasons. And so yes, when you're in relative safety, you have prosperity. You're in a safe neighborhood. Never have really had any kind of violent crime happen to you. There are two things that happen. One is that you might feel really unprepared for violent crime because you've never experienced it. And two is that you have a sense of psychological safety because of that. And so you don't feel threatened watching it. And both of those things can motivate interest in true crime and in horror and the kinds of scary stories.
Now, we mentioned the Black Phone, but do you have a movie that you've seen that has done something or kind of made you think differently when it comes to the horror or true crime genre?
Hmm.
I was thinking The Joker.
The Joker is a good one, yeah. I don't know. Maybe if I did, it wasn't something that just really shook my worldview. But there've probably been now that I think about it, there's probably been just a lot of little ones, right, that have shifted that. I don't know if there is one major one that shifted it, but there's probably been a lot of little ones I've watched that have kind of shifted the way I thought about these kinds of things.
Have you ever thought about just people coming in contact with someone who was a serial killer or someone who knew a serial killer being more? So before I reached out to you, I heard this story at work from a coworker, and they were like, "Yeah, did you know my old boss works at a different location had hired a woman who was the mother of a serial killer." And I was like, wait, what? I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, oh yeah, she found a head in his closet. And I was like, excuse me? And then like she starts explaining it. I swear to you, you can look her up and everything. I'll tell you the name off air. But I saw that TikTok as the guy was describing it. I go, oh my God, I've seen this. And yeah, she does work at my job. But I was like, what is this? I was like, I didn't even know that like in my town, like you would never think in a million years, which was like, I mean, do you see more like it's actually probably more common that there's someone that either knows somebody or is connected to somebody who's probably done some heinous act like that.
Yeah, I imagine most people that are connected in some way to a serial killer are probably trying not to advertise it, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's tough because presumably this person is a normal functioning person.
I go, well, does she have any more kids? And then the guy was like, yeah,
but exactly, right? So, humans understand, we have an intuitive understanding of genetics, right? We have an intuitive understanding of if I breed a big cow with a big bull, I'm going to get big cows, right? We intuitively understand that certain traits are passed on genetically. Many traits are passed on to some extent genetically. And, tendency for violence is one of those. Um, Now, it doesn't mean that family members are going to be violent just because they had a brother that was violent. But, all else being equal, the odds are higher, right? And so that's something that we're going to be sensitive to. And it sucks. It's not fair for the family member who is perfectly normal, to go through that. But that's just kind of the nature of reality, right? Like, yeah, I mean, if you have a brother who's a serial killer, statistically, you're people who have brothers that are serial killers are probably more likely to be a little bit violent. And again, doesn't mean that they are. It's just that if you were to roll the dice, I would bet on that, right?
I'll confirm it that I asked. The younger one apparently is a little bit weird too. I was
Yeah,
like,
I
dang,
mean,
yeah, just stop having kids.
yeah, it's a tough thing, right? Because again, it's kind of a genetic roll of the dice, right? And the odds are not always fair for those kinds of things.
Now, did you choose the true crime thing? You said in 2019 you started kind of looking into this more. How did that actually come about? Like you getting focused into, did you always have an interest in it, or is it just something that you thought, this is like everywhere?
A little of both, I think. I started out just I was interested in why people were interested in violence and interested in scaring themselves, and how we got entertainment out of that, and why were all these people not psychopathic killers like we thought they would be, right? Like millions of people watch horror movies and true crime, and almost none of them do anything violent any more than anyone else who doesn't watch it, right? And so I was really interested in that sort of uh, dynamic.
Well, Colton, I really appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Yeah, my website has I think links to almost my Substack and information about my book that's coming out, such as www.coltonscrivener.com.
Okay, and I'll make sure I link all those in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks everybody for listening to the episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.